I will start us off here real quick.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us for Kingdom Builders, How to Live on Mission for God. Today we have a special guest with us, Sarah Zylstra. She is a senior writer for the Gospel Coalition, where she oversees coverage of faith and work. She earned her master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University, and she is the co-author of the book Gospelbound, Loving with Resolute Hope in an Anxious Age. And I think our age qualifies as anxious. It qualifies. So, Sarah, could you please tell us about how and why you were inspired to write Gospelbound and give us a few examples of the type of stories that you included in the book?
I would love to do that. I started writing this type of story. Well, first of all, let's back up. About 4 years ago, Collin Hansen, I was working at Christianity Today. I had been working there for about 13 years, writing news. And Collin Hansen was at the Gospel Coalition. And he said, why don't you come here and write stories of where God is at work in the world? Like, find places where Christians are really being Christians and write about that. Mm-hmm. And we were like, we didn't hear any of those stories. So we were like, are there any of those stories? Is that even a thing? Because you don't hear that very often. So we weren't sure we'd even be able to write that. Is that even a job? So I started, and basically my job is to follow around the Holy Spirit and write, like, where is God doing something amazing? So for 4 years, I've been writing those stories. You can imagine how amazing it is to have a job where you follow God around and write stories about Christians doing phenomenal things with the help of the Holy Spirit. And so a couple of years ago, Collin was looking at our culture. He thinks big picture, and he's like, gosh, it feels like we're moving so much from a Christian age to a post-Christian age. And how can Christians live in a post-Christian age? And then he was reading Romans, and he's like, the church started in the margins. And for most of history, it's been in the margins. So it's not like we don't know what to do. And right there in Romans laid it out, right? Like, there's so many instructions, extend hospitality, honor each other, care for the weak, love your enemies. It's just all right there. And as soon as he saw those, he was like, we've actually been telling those stories. Like, as we follow people around, that's what Christians do. Those are the stories we've been telling. So what the book does is we put it in 8 chapters, and each one has one of those little instructions. And we explain it a little bit, like how it applies to today, and then fill it up with stories of, like, here's examples of people who are alive today who are doing the things that Romans says to do. That's what this looks like now.
Right. I got you. So, a lot of time, how did you even find these stories? Because, like, when you look at the news, I mean, it sounds kind of bad. When you look at the shape Christians are in the church, or you go to a lot of churches nowadays and not many people showing up, it's like people don't want to go to church. They really don't want to hear about Jesus, So, like, how did you even break through all of the, the bad stuff to get down to where Jesus was working?
I know. That's a good question. That's what we were worried about at the beginning. Like, I don't even know if this is happening.
Yeah.
So what we did was, Collin had been working in this space for a while. So he had a couple ideas at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And one was go to Seattle and see what happened to the church after Mars Hill fell apart. And one of them was, go to China and, well, not go to China, but ask people in China, like, what's happened? What does the church actually look like? It's so murky there. So, like, what is it actually looking like over there? And then, once you start to tell these stories, then someone will say, oh, I know this great story. Hey, I know Sarah tells those stories. I'll just give her a call. So then it's sort of, once you get going, you really just need to get started. Because once you get going, people know you're doing it, and then they think of you when they see that story. So
right.
That's how we get them.
That makes a lot of sense. And obviously you have to be intentionally looking for that kind of thing. It doesn't just like show up on the news one day. But right. So why do you think that we like to focus on negative stuff in the news about Christianity and the culture today?
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of it is, like, did it come from the fall? I don't know, because there is a physical reaction in us. If I showed you a good news story, you'd be like, oh, that's cool. But your
Right.
heart rate wouldn't speed up. Like there's no
No.
physical change in you. You're just like, all right. Like the same thing as if you looked at a blank piece of paper, studies have shown that's the same reaction you
Oh,
have.
that's not good.
That's
Wow.
not good. You just don't respond. But if you read a negative news headline, your heartbeat speeds up, studies show, and like your breathing and your adrenaline
Yeah.
goes, like you're into your fight or flight, like what's happening? And then that anxiety, like then you're clicking on that headline so you can feel like, okay, this is what's happening. And you can like sort of re-regulate yourself, right? Into like, okay, now I know. So there's literally a physical reaction in us. So like, were we created like that? Did we get broken like that? I actually don't know the answer, but we do gravitate toward that. And then of course, news is a business. These people aren't doing this for free. They have to eat. So they're chasing what we're clicking on. So that is one reason why our news leans so much that direction.
Well, I heard something a while back that said that fake news, which is not true, you put some fake news up there and like it goes viral compared to when you actually tell the truth, it's like crickets,
Isn't that crazy? I know.
It is. It really is a mystery. So why do you think Christians are suffering from such high levels of anxiety and fear these days? And there's a thing in there about Resolute Hope. I feel like we could all use some Resolute Hope right now.
We could use some Resolute Hope. So there's a couple reasons. And one is, social media, that's making everybody anxious, and Christians are no exception. Like that fake news. And, just sort of feeling unstable all the time, that makes everybody anxious. But something that is also making Christians anxious is it's pretty clear that we're moving in a post-Christian direction. It's not like we're all the way to where Europe is. For sure, we're not.
Right.
But we are, like the Equality Act makes you anxious. The fact that abortion is even legal can make you anxious. Like that you can sue somebody for not making a cake for your transgender coming out, right? That makes us feel anxious. And those are real things.
Right.
So we're not anxious because we're like, oh, I don't know if my faith is my faith not right? Like we know our faith is true and right. And we know there's sin in the world. I think what's weird for us now is that in America, our society has valued Christianity for so long. Like 30 years ago, it was very respected and pastors were respected and you knew you should go to church, even if you weren't going to church. And so that's shifting, like just the growth of the nuns as the nominals slide, farther into nuns, then we're kind of left with Christianity is rubbing against culture in a way that it has not in the past. And so that's a source of anxiety too.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. When you're used to living in a culture that you fit in with, and everybody's cool and like, oh, you're a Christian. That's great. I want to be like you. But now it's like, oh, no, we don't want none of that business. It's tough to live in an atmosphere where that is the reality, because we all want to be liked,
That's right.
That's one thing that we want to be. But I feel like you can almost make more of a difference when the culture and everybody else is going the other way and you choose to go the way with the gospel. I remember one time in college, I had this
professor,
and she was from Berkeley, I think, California,
Yeah.
Communications class is not a good place for a preacher to be. Just give him a platform and they like to preach, And so this lady, she gave me a hard time, I'll point you out in class and all that, but it was amazing. All these different people in my class, like Mormons, like people who didn't believe in God, like all that kind of stuff, just by the way I responded to those things, like it actually impacted them, and made a difference. And so I think that is a great point. So how do you, as a person who believes that, God exists and that he is good, you look at the problems of the world and it's almost like you want to say, well, is it really worth it? Can I do any good. So how can we prevent from looking at the problems of the world and from stopping us from serving at all and doing nothing?
Isn't that a good question? I think that is, you definitely feel like that. If you ever go on Twitter, which don't, but if you ever do, that's totally what it feels like. Even Facebook, or I don't know, because I'm not on Instagram, but I bet it feels like it can feel like that too. It just feels completely overwhelming.
Right.
So in our book, we suggest two things. And one is to look even bigger picture, like even bigger than international. Look at the whole arc of history and what God has done so far and how all his promises have been kept. And like to step back and think, okay, where are we in the story that started with creation and then the fall and then up to the climax of Jesus on the cross. And now we're in that resolution part of the story. So that's where we're operating. It can help to think like Jesus is coming back. Like we're just in the little tail end before Jesus comes back. And then it helps to look up and remember God's promises, but it also helps to come way back down because studies show people are anxious about the federal government, but they don't feel so anxious about their own town government. And they feel really anxious about like the school, like America's education in general, but their local school, like they know those teachers. And so they're like, oh, well, we sent our kids there. Or they feel really anxious about that other political party, but then they have a niece or a nephew who votes for that party and they're not anxious about that. Like they just love them. That's just their guy,
Yeah.
So, if you can bring it back down to like, how can I help my neighbor with his car? Can I talk to somebody while I'm walking my dog? Can I serve at my church? Could I go to a Bible study at my work? Could I vote or like maybe even run for office in my town or my school board? Like all of a sudden it feels so much more manageable. And I think if you can come that's where the people who are making a difference, they're just like way down into like looking around them and like, oh, but abortion as a whole makes me feel crazy. But hey, I know, my sister's kid is pregnant and I can like throw her a baby shower or offer to babysit, or like all of a sudden it comes down to like, oh, I could do something about that. I could walk in that with them. And then like, I think the combination of those things give you like a gritty hope, like a real true hope and then you can actually start actively working toward it. So
yeah, I mean, I think that makes a huge difference. Just knowing people, because like in our neighborhood, we have a lot of Hispanic families, and you see a lot of stuff on the news about immigration and that sort of thing. But I am telling you right now, if anybody who could look at, we used to have this little family that would come on Wednesday night, and they had a little girl named Sophia. And she was just like the most precious little girl you've ever met in your life. And so it's like, once you know these people, it's like you hear the story about immigration, but you're like, but these people are cool, these are good people, So I do think that makes a large difference. And a lot of the stories in this book, I noticed had to deal with, obviously, helping people, making the world a better place, and the gospel, but so how do we as Christians and as churches, serve the world, serve people, but also not get so focused on serving people that we don't get to the point of sharing the hope of Jesus with them?
Yeah, isn't that a funny distinction? And it's been around for so long, like that debate between like, do you share the gospel or do you focus on serving the poor?
Right.
Which seems like such a weird one because can't you do both? And yet you're right. There are people that are so focused on the gospel that they're not serving the poor. And there are people who are so focused on serving the poor that they're not sharing the gospel. I don't know. I just think like when you're following God with your whole heart and you love him, I think those things come out of you. Don't you?
Right.
Like that's just
yes.
Like when you're talking to Sophia, like you want her to know the Lord, right? So but you also want her to have a coat if it's cold.
Yes.
So when you love people, you want both of those things for them. There doesn't have to be that split there. So I think if you're loving God with your whole heart and loving your neighbor as yourself, both of those things just come out. And there's lots of stories of I know I'm going to tell there's this girl in Memphis. got into the school system, tutoring second graders, can't talk about God at all because she's in the public school, but
Yeah.
starts like being able to like, hey, come over and like, oh, I'm noticing you don't have a coat for the winter. I'm noticing you don't have enough food. I'm noticing your mom isn't here to go to your parent teacher conferences. How about I go? And in the way that you get woven into their life, like the gospel is just there. Like those opportunities to share are just everywhere, everywhere.
Well, and I think that's a good point. I think that when the motivation of our serving comes from the gospel and from Jesus, then we're going to tell them about where that good comes from, because it definitely don't come from me. It comes from Jesus. I mean, like, if it was up to me, I would not be doing that. But because of what Jesus has done for me, I'm gonna put myself out there and sacrifice for his glory. And so I do think that makes a big difference. So tell us about having the right view of time and the problems with both the common perspectives of nostalgia and progressivism. And sometimes we like to think back and say, oh, it used to be so, the world was perfect in 1940. Like you talk to some church members and it's like, wow, there was no sin in 1950. But I mean, like the world, this always has issues.
It has. We just get time isn't, you can just get lost thinking about time because it's such an interesting construct. And to think of God outside of time is even more complicated.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. And Collin especially noticed this. He's like, if you look at the political parties, like they're both warped, right? If you're looking at we need to get back to the golden age. Like, let's just go back to where things were. Like, what is the golden age exactly? What are you talking about?
Yes.
When was life perfect for everyone? I can't think of any time. Like in the Jim Crow days, was that a good time? It just was, there wasn't a good time. Like, we can be honest about that. But also on the same side, on the progressive side too, we can't get to utopia. We can't, like, there's no law, there's no politician, there's nothing that is going to get us to perfection. We just can't. And so when you can realize, and probably everybody leans toward one way or the other. I tend to lean more optimistic. So I tend to be like, I think we can make it better.
Right.
And, and it's not a bad instinct because we are trying to redeem the world.
Yes.
But on the other hand, like you have to look back, like if you look back to Eden, maybe, or forward to heaven, that's kind of where you got to look. Like we're just doing what Jesus said. We can't be on your own. You can't get to either one of those places.
But it's funny, during the election season, I would see advertisements for one party and it'd be like, we have to save America. The other person's the devil. And then you see one for the total opposite party and they'd be like, we have to save America. The other one's the devil, And what I love about this book is the title Gospelbound. As Christians, if we make the source of our identity in Christ, then it makes our ability to chill out about the world a lot easier.
Oh yeah. It just makes everything so much like more in perspective, right? Like, hey, neither one of these guys is a savior and neither one is a devil either,
Right.
Like, they're just people. Yeah.
So one of the stories that you include in your book is how a predominantly white church merged with a predominantly black church in Iowa. Can you share with us a little bit about that? That doesn't seem like it happens a whole lot.
I love this story. Yeah, it doesn't. We had to ask a couple of times, are you sure? Is that what happened? So in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is Iowa is predominantly white.
Correct.
There just wasn't, even during the Great Migration, there just wasn't, they don't have a lot of big cities in Iowa. It's a lot of rural stuff. So it's just family farms.
Yeah.
And so they have this predominantly white town, Cedar Rapids. And inside of it, there was a predominantly white church with a pastor he came from a multi-ethnic church in Des Moines before that. And so he really had a heart for it. So he was really talking about it with this congregation and wishing that their church could be more multi-ethnic. And there was also a predominantly African-American church. And this is unusual, and God bless him. He was like, I want to reach the city. And I know to reach the city, I'm going to have to also, I want to reach white people as well, because it's a white city.
Yeah.
Yes. which is so, because for some, like often for African-American communities, like their church is like, that's the community where they feel comfortable and safe and their culture is done. Like I can
Right.
totally see where you'd be like, hey, I'm just like hanging out here. So I
Yeah.
really admire that about him. Well, what happened is these guys just happened to meet each other. And then they just started hanging like, hey, let's meet and pray together once in a while. And let me tell you, when a couple people say to each other, I don't know what to do, let's just like pray with each other regularly and intentionally. I can't
Right.
tell you how many stories start with that little pattern at the beginning.
Hmm.
They're just praying together. They're not talking about merging. I don't even know if they've thought about it at this point. They're just both like, hey, let's just pray for our churches and our cities when we get together.
Right.
And then, of course, after a while, you become friends and then you do a pulpit swap. And then they're like, let's do an Easter service together. So while their choir was practicing, they were sitting in the pews listening to them. And this one pastor is telling the other one, he's like, we're outgrowing our space. We need to get a new building, but this one fell through and this other one is just too big and nothing's, fitting exactly right. And then the white pastor he was talking to said, well, it wouldn't be too big if we moved in together.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like this moment of quiet. And the white pastor's like, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. He probably thinks I'm so dumb. Like, why did I even open my mouth? Why, like that was
right.
And then the black pastor says to him, like, I was thinking the exact same thing. So God had drawn their hearts in the same way. Like, could we merge our congregations? Now, not only is this weird because one is totally white and one is totally black, but they're also both healthy and growing, which I've never heard of two healthy, growing churches. Usually one is about dead.
Yes.
That's when you're merging, is when somebody's in trouble. But this was definitely, so it was just like a joining of them. And they went to their wives and their wives said, hey, let's try it. They went to their councils, and believe it or not, their councils were like, let's try it. They went to their people, and most of their people overwhelmingly were also like, let's do it. Now, of course, if you just walked into two random churches out of the blue and said that, that's not how it would go.
Correct.
But these pastors had been sharing for years, they had been sharing their hearts with their congregations. Like, this is what we're really wishing. Wouldn't this be great? And so they did. They merged them together, and they're like, guys would come up to us after the service for months later, like kind of weeping a little bit, like, this is so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they've been able to do. So I don't know if you remember the derecho, like the wind that swept over Iowa and knocked over basically all the trees in Cedar Rapids.
Right.
And what they did is they had moved into the larger church, but they still had that other smaller church as a campus. And they served food from there. They handed out water from there. They were able to make it they just want to make that other campus into a place where they do a lot of outreach. And they were like perfectly positioned for the storm that came. And of course, they're doing that all the time anyway in that neighborhood. They've just changed it into outreach. It's just such an encouraging story.
Well, it really is, because you don't see a lot of churches want to work together, whether they're African American or not. I mean, and plus, but that was very good leadership on the pastor, because they just one day say, hey, let's move in together. It's like let's trade pulpits. Let's pray together. And so
it's slow. Yeah.
Because of that, the church people were used to it. They learned to love them. And I think, like you were talking about, it was really great that it all started with just meeting together and praying, and that's how it started. And I think sometimes we're like, well, what do we need to do? We just need an idea. But in reality, all we need to do is ask God, and then he'll show us. And the good thing about God showing us stuff is he actually provides for the idea,
Absolutely. Absolutely. He provides the idea and the ability to do the idea.
Yes. I mean, so just really good there. So how is the persecution of the church under Rome an important perspective to help us have hope in today's world?
Yeah. I think it's just so good to remember that from Rome on, the church has almost always, throughout time and space, lived in the margins. Like, the church is almost always, you'll find the church with the suffering and the poor and the outcast, those on the edges of society. It's right. Besides the United States and Europe for a while, like, it's rare to find the church in charge of government, or a Christian nation. And so I think it's just so helpful to remember as you look back, and especially at that early church too, like, this is what you do. It's not like we don't know what to do. The church has done this before.
Right.
So
Yeah.
look back, here's sort of the game plan of, here, just like a little instruction book of like, we can receive those letters now in a different way than we could before.
Well, I think it's interesting. It's like you read the book of Acts in the early church, and if they were a church now, they would be on like Outreach's top 100 growing churches. But yet they probably didn't have a fancy children's ministry area. They didn't have, really nice sanctuary with great sound system or lights. Like, they had none of that, but yet they probably did more than what we do today. And so that is pretty mind-boggling. One of the things that I really liked that I read in an excerpt of your book was the conversation that you had with these Chinese church leaders. And so, are we fooling ourselves to think that we should be totally free from persecution in our culture?
Boy, I mean, until we get to heaven, I think we are like,
yes,
we are
yes.
fooling ourselves. Like, there's no, even if the laws were right? Like, there's
Right.
still not only people who break the laws, but we're not perfect. We can't make perfect laws. I mean, this is the classic problem of communism, right? Of like,
Yes.
if communism or socialism rests on the idea that your government would literally be perfect, that they would be able to perfectly distribute resources, that they would have a perfect, foresight into the future of what exactly is going to happen. And like, they would be able to like perfectly, that somebody somewhere would be able to, design this society exactly right.
Right.
Yes. And we can't, clearly. So our democracy is not perfect either. For sure, there's troubles in it, and people are exploiting other people, and there needs to be some guidelines, and the guidelines won't be perfect either. We're never going to get there. We just can't get there.
Right. Yeah. And you look at the conversation you had with those Chinese leaders, it's like, if we ask people in America what their biggest problem was, we'd be like, well, they got a bad government,
Yeah.
And, but when you talk to them, they're like, look, the worst thing that can happen to us is a love of money and secularism. And I'm like, that's scary, because that's what we like to do in America.
That's right. That's right.
So,
and they're not wrong. You're right. Because that makes you feel so comfortable here. And then you're not looking for, and then your gaze has shifted from Jesus and from heaven onto like, how can I make my house more comfortable? How can I make my job more better? Like, aren't we all constantly like, how can we improve just a little bit more to make us a little bit more perfect?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and you look at how successful the church is in China, even with a difficult government. I didn't realize that communism was designed around the idea that they could do it perfectly. But I think that's a good example of, trying to make perfection is probably at the heart of legalism, and so as Christians, I think that shows us like, look, nobody wants to be a communist, so we shouldn't want to be a legalist either, because it does not work.
It doesn't work.
And it's amazing you talked about those two churches, and what I found is that, it really doesn't matter like how old you are or what ethnicity you are or anything like that, that love transpires over all boundaries. There was we have a ministry at our church. It's a basketball ministry, and it's a lot of African-American young men. They come, they play basketball, and then we have a Bible study, and we have a devotion, and one of their babies passed away, and he asked me to be a part of the funeral, and it's just like, sometimes we make it harder than it really is. If we would just love people, it's kind of like, I feel like at a lot of churches, if the people love the community is going to love the church.
Yeah.
If the church does not love the community, the community is not going to love the church. So that's very good.
Yeah.
What do you hope people who read Gospel Bound will take away from it, and where can people find out more information?
I hope what they take away from it is kind of what you just said about we make it harder than it is, right?
Yeah.
Like it's really just, hey, having somebody over for dinner once in a while. Like it's just simple. Like it's around basketball or around food. You can do a
Right.
lot with a meal. Like if you just consistently have people over for dinner, you would be amazed, right? Or if you're
Yes.
like, we don't know what's happening in this city. We're having such a race problem. But if I just get together with these other pastors and we pray intentionally over a period of time,
Mhm.
all the relationships that develop out of that, that's just, I hope what they would take away is just like a piece that it's not that hard.
Right.
We're just following God, and then you're just doing the little things. One of the stories in the book is so simple. This girl, she's like at church, when I just want people to feel welcome. So
Mhm.
I'll just go sit by somebody who's, well, this is pre-COVID, but you could probably do it
Right. Right.
post-COVID too.
Yes. Yes.
I'll just
Correct.
go sit by somebody who's new or somebody who's single, or just to sit with them at church. Like, what a
Mhm.
simple thing is that? Like, I'll just talk with you. And it's really, I think we get paralyzed in looking at like, oh man, the numbers and the craziness of it and the policies, that makes us feel crazy. But if you just come right back down into like, oh, turn off your phone and take a walk around your neighborhood, or show up at your church and keep showing up at your church and get in that Bible study and go to that, basketball ministry,
Right.
and just
Right.
like keep showing up. And that's where stuff, like, you get some momentum there.
Well, I like the story about the little girl sitting beside somebody in church, and as people have researched churches and that type of situation in today's world, they've discovered that really what people want nowadays is community.
Mm,
And actually, I feel like that's good news because, it's a little more difficult to have just awesome content. With community, hey, if you got a heart that beats and some lungs that work, like that's all you're qualified.
absolutely.
You can create community, and like that little girl, she's already going to church. So sit
Just sit
beside that
beside.
person and makes a great impact. And so in chapter 6, you talk about setting another seat at the table. What do you mean by that, and why is that so important?
Yeah, I love that you led with that, because that leads right. That's where the chapter where that story is.
Okay, good deal.
Yeah, just like, boy, to extend that hospitality. And we use setting another seat at the table because it's just such a, like, you can picture it.
Yes.
Right. It's just like such a visceral thing of like, just come and sit with us at this table.
Right. Right.
And it's also so, in one sense, it's just so simple to do. And in another sense, it's so important for evangelism, because
Mhm.
apologetics, if you talk to apologetics experts today, it is quite a different world out there than it was in the days of Billy Graham, when they would
Yes.
take a church bus through a neighborhood and get a bunch of people and bring them over there. And then by the end of the night, they'd be saved. You can't
Oh,
do that
yeah.
anymore. Nobody's going to get on your bus. Um, but what you can't, so you have to, like, it comes down to what you're talking about, like the community and the relationships. Like, really, if you have a microwave, you could do this, because you just be like, come over, let's have some hot chocolate, and like, let's just sit on my front steps or whatever. Like, to extend that hospitality, to open up your life so
Mhm.
that you're just walking with somebody through life, so that they can see that you're different. Like, oh, I heard Christians were like homophobic and racist and right. But I'm watching
Right.
you live and I don't see any of that. I see
Yes.
joy. I see hope, a real gritty hope.
Mhm.
I see caring. I just like, I want that. Like, to be able to you have to invite the people in so they can even see it, to desire it. Um,
Right, right. Well, and I think that's a good point. Sometimes it makes a better argument when they actually see the benefits of it.
oh yeah.
Whereas you just say, "Hey, you need this because it's going to be great," but then they don't know anybody, and also it is amazing how great hospitality is, like how good it works. I mean, like I found that people may not come to the church, but like I I will have very few reject an offer to come eat at my house. Like,
Right.
and I guess that's because it doesn't matter if you're an atheist, if you're, a different belief, if you're, living in this horrible lifestyle, whatever, everybody has to eat. Like, you got to
They
eat or
do.
you're going to die. And like, some people may not like the gospel, but all of them like ice cream. So if you can,
right.
you get them over to your house, you get them in that atmosphere. And I think sometimes it's hard to do that though, because when we invite someone over, we become vulnerable with them. And I don't know about anybody else's house, but mine is not always clean,
Yes, right.
And
I
then the
think
cooking
yeah,
thing, so it's
yeah,
difficult, but I feel like you said, when you do it, you see the benefits of that. I can think of one one family, and they drop their kids off on Wednesday nights, and they would never come to church, and so I invited them over to lunch, Sunday dinner for lunch, and the next time I seen them, her mother worked at a gas station. The next time I saw her, she was like, "Hey, there's my pastor." She never come to my church, at my house.
yep, yep,
And so you're right. It does make another difference. And like you said, a microwave is enough.
yeah.
If you got a microwave, you can make a
Do
frozen
something.
meal.
Yep.
Something, and you don't even have to cook it. You can get other people to cook it,
Yep.
So
And it's a
that,
muscle too. I think you don't have to start with a meal. You could start with sitting on your front porch after dinner, right? Like you can start
yes,
with
yeah.
smiling at somebody. You can start with praying consistently for your neighbors. Like
Mhm.
you can just work your way, like push yourself just one, like now I'm going to say hi and ask them how they're doing on our walk
Yeah.
when I run into them. Now I'm going to ask if they want to walk with me. Now I'm
Yeah.
going to, it can just be one little relationship step at a time.
Well, I think that's good to start small. Sometimes if we have goals that are so big, we just never accomplish.
That's right.
You know,
Yeah. It has to be small enough that you can kind of see yourself doing it. Right. And pray for God. And of course, like if you ask God, he'll open up opportunities too.
Oh, for sure. And, it's kind of like when I first got to the church I'm at now, it was mostly an older senior adult congregation, but some of them would tell me stories about, years ago when it was a thriving church. And one of the things they did years ago when it was a thriving church was that this lady and her husband that lived in the community would host a dessert and coffee on Sunday night. And so and it wasn't just for church members, but the people who were new on Sunday morning, they would invite them to their house for dessert and coffee. And so, we forget about the impact that it can make. I tell people all the time, if you want me to be there, just feed me,
That's right.
hey, I'm there if you got some food,
That's right. That's right. That's good.
Yes. So where can people find your book at and more information about it?
Yes, you can go to gospelboundbook.com.
Okay.
Or you can it'll be out April 6th. And
Okay.
then you can already pre-order it, Amazon, anywhere, Barnes and Noble, anywhere that you can,
Right.
that sells books.
Okay. Well, good deal.
That's good.
Well,
and if you want to read more stories, if you just go to the Gospel Coalition. Yeah. Or you just search for like Sarah Zylstra, which is Zylstra. I have been writing these stories for 4 years. So there's 4 years worth of
oh, wow.
stories of what God has been doing all around the world.
That is great. And it helps to know some encouraging stories, that
it gives you some ideas, right?
Yes. It's very good. Well, thank you for coming on the show. And for those of you listening, thank you for listening to Kingdom Builders, and have a great week. Goodbye.